The knife in Weston Kane's hand didn't so much as tremble when the girl's voice cut across the private dining room of the Gilded Anchor, because a man who's ordered the ends of a dozen lives doesn't flinch at a whisper. Yet something in the way she asked stopped him cold all the same. "Excuse me, sir. Would you let me take whatever you're not going to finish? I haven't eaten in 4 days." She stood at the edge of the candlelight in a rain-soaked coat, 2 sizes too big. Red hair plastered to a face gone pale as candle wax, a faded canvas backpack clutched against her chest like it held the last pieces of a life she refused to set down. She couldn't have been more than 27. There was a small scar at the corner of her left brow, an old one, and her hands were raw with cold. But it wasn't the hunger or the ruined shoes that held Weston's attention. It was her eyes, steady and unafraid, even as 3 of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard turned to look at her. Eyes that carried a quiet dignity poverty hadn't managed to strip away, and for one impossible second, the most feared crime boss in Boston felt the ground tilt beneath a memory he'd buried 10 years deep. His bodyguard's hand moved toward his jacket on instinct. Weston lifted 2 fingers off the tablecloth, and the man went still. The matron was already rushing over, apologies tumbling out ahead of him, reaching to seize her arm and haul her back into the freezing dark where he clearly believed she belonged. And that was the moment everything changed, because the girl's gaze snapped away from Weston and locked onto the bodyguard by the door. "Sir, you're bleeding. Under your vest, on the left side. If that's what I think it is, you've got maybe 20 minutes before it's too late to stop it." The room went silent as a held breath. The bodyguard looked down. A dark stain was spreading through the fabric where no one had thought to look. She wasn't a beggar reciting a sad story. She'd walked into a den of killers, half-starved and soaked to the bone, and the first thing she'd done was try to save one of their lives. And Weston Kane, a man who trusted no one and owed nothing to anybody, suddenly found himself needing to know exactly who this girl was. If you believe everyone deserves one person willing to look them in the eye and see their worth, hit that like button, share this with someone whose heart needs it today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to that rain-soaked evening at the Gilded Anchor, and find out what a mafia boss does next when a starving stranger saves a life instead of begging for one. In the moment when every eye was still fixed on the dark stain spreading across the bodyguard's suit, the girl did not wait for anyone's permission. She dropped her worn belongings onto the polished wooden floor with a dull slap, crossed a room filled with men who could take her life in a single breath, and knelt beside the man who was beginning to turn pale from blood loss. "Sit down here. Lean your back against the wall. Don't try to stand anymore," she said, her voice suddenly nothing like the trembling voice that had just been begging for food, now calm and solid, like someone who had done this 100 times. The bodyguard, a man named Cormac Finn, with a massive frame and the eyes of someone who had walked through war, instinctively reached out to stop her wrist. But Weston Kane only tilted his head slightly, and that hand let go. She pulled the front of Cormac's suit jacket aside, revealing the shirt beneath it already darkened in a spreading patch. Then, with fingers numbed by rain but not clumsy in the slightest, she pressed her palm hard just below his left rib. Cormac hissed a breath through his teeth. "This stab wound isn't deep enough to kill him right away, but it cut a small blood vessel and blood is pooling inside," she said quickly, her eyes never leaving her own hand. "If you let him keep standing there for another 15 minutes, his blood pressure will drop, and by then even the best doctor in Boston will have a hard time bringing him back. I need a clean towel, as thick as possible, and someone call an ambulance right now." No one moved. The entire room, the most powerful men on the East Coast, stood rooted in place, staring at a soaked homeless girl giving them orders as though she were the one holding everything in her hands. It was Weston who broke the silence. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to raise his voice. He only lifted his chin slightly toward the banquet table, and at once, a trembling server hurried over and placed a whole stack of snow-white linen napkins into her hands. She folded them into a thick pad, placed it over the wound, then took Cormac's large hand and pressed it down on top. "Hold this down yourself. Press hard. Don't lift it, no matter how much it hurts," she instructed, then turned toward a man standing nearby. "Take off your belt. I need to secure it." That man, a well-known underworld figure whose name alone was enough to keep half the city awake at night, looked at her for a moment, then silently obeyed. She threaded the belt around Cormac's waist and tightened it to hold the folded cloth firmly in place, and throughout the entire process, her hands did not tremble even once, though her whole body was close to giving out after 4 days with nothing in her stomach. Weston Kane stood there, watching every movement she made, and inside him something very old, very deep, began slowly to shift. He had seen too many people in his life. People who dropped to their knees and begged when a gun was pressed to their throat. People who betrayed friends to save themselves. People who saw a man dying and only wondered whether that death would disturb their dinner. But this girl, a human being with nothing in her hands except a torn backpack and an empty stomach, had walked straight into the middle of a wolf pack, and the first thing she thought of was not the food she had just begged for, but keeping a stranger alive. When the ambulance siren finally wailed through the rain outside and Cormac was carried away on a stretcher, his hand still gripping her wrist as though he did not want to let go, the girl slowly stood. Her knees buckled for a moment. The world around her swayed, and she had to hold on to the edge of the table to keep from falling. Only then did she remember who she was, where she was, and what people in this room could do to someone like her. She bent down, picked up her backpack, hugged it to her chest, and murmured in a voice that had returned to its original weakness. "I'm sorry for disturbing your meal. I'll leave now." She turned toward the door, where the wet, cold night waited to swallow her again, when Weston's voice sounded behind her, low and clear, a sentence no one in the room had expected. "Sit down." She froze, not daring to believe what she had heard, and turned her head to look back. Weston Kane had returned to his seat at the head of the table, his hand pointing to the empty chair directly across from him, and for the first time that evening, his cold gray eyes carried no threat. "You said you haven't eaten in 4 days," he said, his voice not quite an invitation and not quite a command, but something in between, something he had forgotten how to give a very long time ago. "Then sit down and eat. No one in this room is allowed to touch you." The girl stood motionless at the threshold, rainwater still dripping from the hem of her coat onto the floor, and in her eyes, the hard light from moments before suddenly shimmered as though it were about to break, because it had been too long. So long that she had almost forgotten the feeling, since the last time someone had looked at her and asked her to sit down as though she were still a human being. The girl took cautious steps toward the empty chair, moving slowly as though the floor beneath her feet might collapse at any moment. And when she sat down on the edge of the seat, she still did not let the backpack leave her lap, hugging it tightly against her chest, like a fragile shield between herself and a room full of people who could make her vanish from the world with nothing more than a flick of the hand. Weston gave a slight signal, and the server appeared again, this time placing before her a steaming bowl of seafood chowder and a warm, crusty loaf of bread, the very food she had risked herself only moments earlier to ask for. She looked at the plate, then lifted her eyes to Weston, and for a moment, anyone watching could see an entire struggle in those eyes. The gnawing hunger of 4 days and the dignity of a person who had never wanted to accept charity. "Eat," Weston said, briefly, and only then did she pick up the spoon. She ate slowly, one spoonful at a time, trying to keep her hands from trembling, trying to eat like someone who still remembered how she had once been taught to behave with decency, even though her whole body was screaming to devour everything. Around the long table, the other gang leaders could not hide their discomfort. A man with graying hair and a heavy gold ring on his finger set his wineglass down hard on the table. "Weston, we are in the middle of an important discussion," he said, his voice thick with implication. "Since when did you start picking up strays from the street and seating them at the same table with us?" Weston did not even bother to look at him, only slowly turned the wineglass in his hand. "Since one of those strays saved the life of my man, while the rest of you were still sitting here with your arms folded," he answered, his voice light as silk and cold as steel, and the whole table fell silent. The girl stopped with the spoon halfway lifted, feeling the weight of all those eyes stabbing into her, and she gently set it down. "I didn't mean to disturb your meeting," she said softly. "I only meant to ask for a little food and leave right away." The gray-haired man let out a contemptuous laugh. "You meant to leave right away? Do you know what you just heard in this room, girl?" There was a clear threat in that question, and the air around the table suddenly thickened. But the girl did not lower her head or look away. She lifted her eyes and looked straight into the face of the man trying to frighten her, then answered in a voice strangely calm, "Sir, I just spent 10 minutes keeping a man from dying right here on this carpet. If you think I still have the mind to remember or care what all of you were discussing, then you have given far too much credit to the brain of someone who hasn't eaten in 4 days." For a moment, the whole room went dead still, and then from the head of the table, a soft sound rose. Laughter, Weston Kane was laughing. A low, brief laugh. Something the men around that table had not heard in many years. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated for a beat, then answered, "Ruby. Ruby Callahan." The moment the name left her mouth, Weston felt something ache inside him, a feeling he could not name, because the way she lifted her chin when she was cornered, the way the corner of her mouth tightened and then loosened as she tried to hold back her fear, and most of all those eyes both exhausted beyond measure and stubbornly unwilling to surrender, pulled him back to a place he had locked away inside himself for 10 years. He had once known eyes like that, the same stubborn shade whenever someone told that girl there were things she could not do, the same straight-backed way of sitting even when the whole world was trying to press her down. That girl had once worn a white coat too, had once placed her hands on the wounds of strangers without thinking of herself, and that girl had died on a cold sidewalk while an entire city walked past and no one stopped. Weston tightened his grip on the stem of the wineglass until his knuckles turned white, and he had to force himself back into the present, back to the room, back to the red-haired girl sitting before him and looking at him with confusion because of his sudden silence. "Have you finished eating?" he asked, his voice rougher than he wanted it to be. Ruby nodded and gently pushed the clean plate away. "Thank you. I truly thank you. But I have to go now. The rain outside should be easing soon." She said that, but both of them knew clearly that nothing waited for her out there except dark alleys and the skin-cutting cold of a Boston night in November. Weston stood, tall and composed, his shadow stretching across the table. "It is raining. You have nowhere to go, and the man you just saved is mine," he said. "In this city, when someone saves a man belonging to Weston Kane, they aren't left outside in the rain. Let me take you somewhere warm, at least for tonight." Ruby looked at him, and inside her, 1,000 warning bells rang out at once, because she knew powerful men never gave anything without demanding twice as much in return. But she also knew that tonight, if she walked out that door, she might not live until morning. "Thank you, but I can't," Ruby said, rising from the chair and tightening her grip on the strap of the backpack over her shoulder. "I'm not used to accepting things I can't repay. You've given me a meal, and that's more than enough for me, more than I've dared hope for in months. I'll manage on my own." Weston looked at her, and across that cold face there passed something almost like respect, because he was far too used to people waiting to snatch up anything he threw their way. Yet here was a girl with nothing in her hands, refusing a warm roof in the middle of a rainy night, just to hold on to her dignity. "How exactly are you planning to manage?" he asked, his voice carrying no mockery, only the simple desire to know. "It's 37 degrees out there, and it'll get colder after midnight. Where are you going to sleep?" Ruby pressed her lips together and did not answer, because she had no answer at all, or more precisely, the only answer she had, some bridge underpass, or the doorway of an abandoned warehouse, was not something worth saying in front of this man. "I've survived nights worse than this." She said only that, then turned and walked toward the door, though every step felt as heavy as lead, and the world before her kept threatening to tilt. She had managed only a few steps when she had to stop, one hand gripping the back of a chair, because the room suddenly spun and tiny black spots danced in front of her eyes. 4 days without food, the hot soup she had just poured into an empty stomach, the whole evening spent soaked in rain, and 10 minutes of forcing herself to save a man's life, all of it finally came crashing down at once. She drew in a deep breath, trying to force herself upright, but her body had been drained to its last drop of strength. Weston stepped closer, not touching her, only standing near enough to catch her if she fell. "You're exhausted," he said quietly. "Your body is turning against you. If you walk out tonight, you won't make it more than 3 blocks. Ruby let out a weak, bitter laugh. "Are you a doctor?" Weston shook his head. "No, but I've seen enough people at the end of their strength to know what it looks like." She leaned fully against the back of the chair, and perhaps because she was too tired, too hungry, too worn down, she let slip something she should have kept to herself, the old part of her rising up like an instinct rooted deep in flesh and blood. "I know, my pulse is fast and weak, my skin is cold and damp. These are early signs of blood pressure dropping from exhaustion and low blood sugar. If I don't lie down within the next half hour, I'll faint, and fainting outside in 37-degree weather would be." She let the sentence trail off, but Weston no longer heard the rest, because the way she had just described her own condition, clearly, calmly, precisely down to each medical term, as though she were standing beside a patient's bed rather than speaking about her own body, made him stop halfway, his whole body going rigid, as though he had touched a cold current running down his spine. He had heard someone speak exactly that way before. The same strangely calm tone when talking about the most frightening things. The same habit of turning personal pain into a medical case that needed to be handled, as though if it could be named in clinical language, it might somehow become a little less terrifying. The girl from years ago had done exactly the same thing, had once sat beside him and recited her own symptoms in the voice of a nurse examining a stranger, and Weston had realized it too late, not until everything was already far too late. He stood there in the middle of the room, looking at the red-haired girl swaying as she clung to the back of the chair, and for one brief moment, he no longer saw Ruby, but another figure, one he had buried deep for 10 years, and had sworn to himself he would never let anyone touch again. "You're a nurse," Weston said, not as a question but as something he had just realized, and his voice turned strangely hoarse. Ruby looked up at him, startled by the sudden change in the man's eyes that only moments earlier had been as cold as steel, and now carried a pain she could not understand. "I used to be," she answered softly, and an entire long story lay folded inside those words. Used to be. A story she had no intention of telling. Weston stayed silent for a long while, then turned toward a man standing near the door, and gave an order in a voice that allowed no one to argue. "Bring the car to the rear gate. We're going home." Then he turned back to Ruby, and this time his voice was no longer an invitation or an order, but something almost like pleading, though pleading was something a man like Weston Kane had forgotten how to do a very long time ago. "You don't owe me anything, and I won't ask anything from you. But tonight you're not going to die in the street while I have more than enough to stop it. Consider it helping a man who has spent his whole life failing to save anyone in time finally do one right thing." And Ruby, too exhausted to keep resisting, finally nodded. The car drove for almost an hour through the rain, leaving behind the brightly lit streets of Boston and plunging into the thick darkness of the coast. And when it finally stopped, Ruby pressed her face close to the cold window glass and held her breath. Before her, standing on a headland that jutted out over the sea, was a gray stone mansion so vast she could not see all of it in the dark, its tall windows casting out a pale golden light, and far behind it came the steady sound of waves striking the cliffs, a sound both magnificent and hauntingly lonely. This didn't look like a home, she thought. It looked like a fortress, a place built not for living but for defense, with high walls and cameras that silently turned with every step. When Weston led her through the heavy oak door into the foyer, a woman was already waiting there, small in build but perfectly upright, her silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, and her stiff white apron pressed so flat there wasn't a single wrinkle in it. This was Agnes Doherty, the woman who had managed this house for 25 years, the woman who had watched Weston grow from a shattered teenage boy into the man the whole city feared, and she looked at the soaked girl standing beside her master with eyes as sharp as knives, sweeping from her matted red hair down to her torn shoes and shabby pack. "Master Weston," Agnes said, her voice polite but unable to hide its tension. "May I have a word with you in private?" Weston gave a slight nod and stepped aside with her. But the house was so silent that Ruby could still hear every word. "You brought a stranger here," Agnes whispered urgently. "Someone you met only a few hours ago, someone whose background you know nothing about. You know better than anyone what kind of people have tried to get into this house. What if she was planted by someone else? What if everything tonight was a performance arranged in advance?" Weston remained silent for a while, and in that silence, Ruby understood that he had thought of it too. That this man wasn't naive, that even while opening the door of his home to her, some part of him was still weighing, calculating, guarding itself. "You're right, Agnes," he answered softly. "She could be exactly that. And if she is, you know how I'll handle it." The sentence sent a cold shiver down Ruby's spine. But then, Weston's voice softened, carrying a tone Agnes had not heard in many years. "But you weren't there to see it. You didn't see the way she knelt beside Cormac. You didn't see her hands when everyone else only stood and watched. Someone planted to harm me wouldn't risk her life to save one of my men in the very first moment, when she didn't even know who I was. I owe her a life, and in this city, a debt like that can't be paid by throwing someone back into the street in the middle of a rainy night." Agnes still wasn't satisfied, her lips pressed tight, but she had served this man long enough to know when he could no longer be moved. "Then where would you like me to arrange for her to stay?" she asked, clearly emphasizing the word her. Weston glanced at Ruby, who was standing shivering in the vast foyer, hugging her backpack tightly and trying not to show that she was trembling. Whether from cold or fear, no one could have said. "Prepare a warm bedroom. Give her dry clothes and something hot to drink," he said. "And Agnes, she is a guest. As long as she remains under this roof, she will be treated as a guest." Agnes nodded stiffly, then stepped toward Ruby, and in the coldly polite voice of someone who had served others for far too long to let her true feelings show, she said, "Please follow me." Ruby hesitated and looked at Weston for a moment, as though searching for permission, or perhaps for reassurance, and he only gave a slight nod. As she followed Agnes up the grand curving staircase, her fingers brushing lightly over the polished wooden banister, she looked back down at the vast foyer below, at the towering walls covered in paintings yet strangely cold, at the glittering crystal chandeliers that warmed nothing, and Ruby suddenly realized something she had not expected. This house, this magnificent fortress worth a fortune, did not hold even the smallest warmth of a home. It was silent and hollow like a museum locked after closing time, and the man who lived inside it, though he held an entire empire in his hands and made the city bow its head, might be the loneliest human being she had ever met, and for reasons she could not understand. Amid the fear still trembling inside her chest, something even stranger rose within her, a feeling of compassion. Agnes led Ruby down the second-floor hallway, and her steps stopped before a door near the staircase, her hand already resting on the knob, ready to open it, when Weston's voice sounded from behind them, low and clear, a sentence that made the old housekeeper's whole body stiffen. "Not that room, Agnes. Prepare the room at the end of the hallway for her." Agnes spun around, and for the first time that evening, the professional calm on her face shattered completely, giving way to such stunned disbelief that she forgot to compose herself. "Master Weston," she blurted out, her voice trembling, "you can't possibly mean that room. That room has been locked for 10 years. No one has been allowed to step inside since." She left the sentence unfinished, her frightened eyes darting to Ruby and then back to her master, as though even mentioning that room was a forbidden thing. Weston climbed the last few steps, and when he moved into the light of the hallway lamp, Ruby saw on his face something she had never seen in this man before, a naked, ancient pain, the kind of pain people spend a decade learning how to bury but never truly heal. "I know how long it has been locked, Agnes," he said softly, and in his voice there was no longer any trace of cold authority, only the weariness of a man opening an old wound with his own hands. "I'm the one who locked it. Do you think I could ever forget that day?" Agnes stood still, her hands clasped tightly together, and in those aging eyes Ruby saw tears beginning to shine. "But why, sir?" she whispered. "Why now? Why her?" Weston did not answer right away. He walked to the door at the end of the hallway, placed his hand on the cold wood covered with a thin layer of dust, and stood there for a long while as though listening to something coming from inside, a voice only he could hear. "Because she needs somewhere warm," he finally answered, "and that is the warmest room in this house. It faces east. In the morning, sunlight pours in. A room that beautiful shouldn't be left locked in the dark forever." But both Agnes and Ruby understood that this was not the real reason, or at least not the whole truth, though neither of them dared say it aloud. Agnes took from the key ring at her waist a key dulled with age from years of disuse, and her hand trembled as she slid it into the lock. The door opened with a dry creak, and a stale, cold breath of air, faintly carrying the scent of time, poured into the hallway. Ruby did not step inside. She only stood at the threshold and looked, and what she saw made her heart tighten. It was a beautiful room, painfully beautiful, with walls painted a warm ivory and a large window overlooking the sea, but everything inside was covered in white dust cloths, the blurred shapes of furniture lying silent beneath the fabric like sleeping ghosts. On the windowsill was a flower pot that had dried and withered long ago, and on the small table set against the wall, beneath the covering cloth, she could make out the faint outlines of picture frames lying face down, as though someone had not had the courage to look at them anymore, and had turned them over instead. The whole room gave off a thick sorrow, the sorrow of a place once filled with life, and then abandoned halfway through, frozen forever in the moment when the person who belonged to it went away and never returned. Ruby lifted her eyes to Weston, and she did not ask anything, because there are some pains a person can understand just by looking, and because she too carried rooms like that inside her own heart, places she had locked and thrown away the key because she did not have the strength to step inside again. "I don't need a room this large, sir," she said softly, her voice filled with understanding rather than politeness. "A small corner, A chair. That would be more than enough for me. You don't need to open this room because of me. Weston turned to look at her. And for one long moment, those two strangers simply stood there gazing at each other across the threshold of the forgotten room, each one recognizing in the other something very much like themselves. No, he said, his voice growing hoarse. It is time this room welcomed the light again. Perhaps it has been in the dark too long, just like everything else in this house. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway, leaving Agnes quietly wiping her tears and Ruby standing at the threshold, hugging her backpack tightly, suddenly understanding that this splendid fortress had not been built to keep enemies outside, but to imprison a grief that had ruled within it for 10 long years. That night, Ruby slept in the room at the end of the hallway, between warm, clean blankets, the likes of which she had not touched in a very long time. But her sleep was restless, and when the first light of dawn slipped through the gap in the curtains, she woke with the strange feeling of someone unaccustomed to sleeping beneath a real roof. She left the room very quietly, intending to find her way down to the kitchen and ask for a glass of water. But as she passed the room that had been locked for 10 years until the night before, she saw that the door was still slightly open, and morning sunlight was pouring inside, falling over the white dust cloths with such a gentle light that she could not resist stopping. She did not mean to pry, she told herself that. She only wanted to see the room once in daylight, and perhaps, only perhaps, pull away the covering cloths so this beautiful room could breathe again after so many years of suffocation. Ruby stepped inside, and her hand gently lifted the cloth from the table set against the wall, revealing the picture frame still lying face down. She hesitated for a moment, then turned one frame over. From inside the photograph, a young woman smiled at her, a girl around 23 or 24 years old, with chestnut hair and bright eyes shining with the joy of being alive. And what made Ruby's throat tighten was the white coat the girl was wearing, the stethoscope resting loosely around her neck, and the small badge pinned to her chest that clearly bore the word nurse. She turned over another frame, then another, and the story slowly appeared before her eyes like fragments of a life that had stopped halfway through. Here was that girl on the day she graduated from nursing school, holding her diploma high. Beside a young man Ruby needed a moment to recognize as Weston, a younger, softer Weston, with a smile she could not imagine ever appearing on the cold face of the man from the night before. Here were the two siblings standing by the sea. Here was that girl holding a patient's newborn baby with tenderness in her eyes. And here, in the final frame, was the girl standing before a bed of bright yellow flowers, marigolds, her arms full of them, and her smile so radiant that the whole photograph seemed to glow. On the table, there was also a worn leather notebook, and when Ruby carefully opened it, she saw pages crowded with a young woman's handwriting. Notes about shifts, about patients, about the simple dreams of someone just beginning her life. And on the first page, written neatly by hand, was the owner's name, Marigold Kane. Marigold. Ruby silently repeated that name, the marigold flower, and she immediately understood why the room seemed to carry the shadow of those yellow flowers, why the dried pot on the windowsill had once been bright with color. She was my sister. Weston's voice sounded from the threshold, making Ruby start and turn around, the notebook nearly slipping from her hands. He stood there with one shoulder leaning against the doorframe, and on his face there was none of the anger she had feared, only the deep exhaustion of a man who had just entered a room full of ghosts. Marigold. She was 6 years younger than me. When our parents died, I was only 19, and she was just a 13-year-old child. For years, I did everything, to protect her and put her through school, so she would never have to step into the world I had chosen. Weston stepped into the room slowly, and his hand brushed across the photograph of the girl in the white coat. She hated what I did to make money. She wanted to save people, not hurt them, so she studied nursing, and she was a good nurse, better than anything I ever became in my life. She had just turned 22 and started her dream career when that fateful night 10 years ago arrived. She got off her shift late and walked home alone, and along the way, a man collapsed, a stranger. She stopped to save him, the way she always did. But when she needed help, when she collapsed right there on that cold sidewalk, an entire street full of people walked past her. Not one person stopped. Not one. His voice broke, and Ruby saw the most powerful man in Boston, the man who made the whole city afraid, standing there with his shoulders trembling faintly. For 10 years I have asked myself, if only one person, just one stranger, had stopped for her the way she always stopped for others. Perhaps she would still be alive. Weston lifted his eyes to Ruby, and in those cold gray eyes there now shimmered something deeply human, something terribly fragile. Then last night, in that restaurant, I saw a starving girl walk into the middle of a wolf pack, and the first thing she did was kneel down to save a stranger. You did exactly what an entire city failed to do for my sister. And in that moment, Ruby finally understood why this man had brought her home, why he had opened the room that had been locked for 10 years. She was not a beggar being pitied. She was an echo, an act of atonement, a second chance for something that could never be repaired. The days that followed passed through the house by the sea like a quiet stream seeping into every dry and barren corner, and Ruby, though invited to stay as a guest, could not sit still and simply enjoy it, because in all her life she had never learned how to receive without giving something back. On the first morning, when Agnes stepped into the kitchen, she froze at the sight of the red-haired girl already standing there, sleeves rolled high, scrubbing the old copper pots the housekeeper had not had time to touch in far too long. "You do not need to do these things," Agnes said, her voice still carrying the guarded coldness of the first few days. "You are Master Weston's guest." Ruby only smiled and kept polishing the pot. "I've never been very good at being a guest, ma'am. If I just sit around doing nothing, I'll go out of my mind. Besides," she lifted her eyes, sincere and unguarded, "managing a house this large by yourself must be exhausting. Let me help you a little." Agnes did not answer, but she also did not send her away, and that was already a beginning. Ruby noticed that the old housekeeper often rubbed and kneaded her right hand whenever the weather turned cold, the joints swollen and stiff, and one afternoon, she quietly prepared a basin of warm water with salt, set it in front of Agnes, and gently took the woman's aching hand. "Arthritis," she said softly, her fingers skillfully massaging along each knuckle. "Soaking it in warm salt water every night will help a great deal, and don't hold cold things with your bare hands anymore." Agnes sat still, watching the girl bow her head as she cared for her aging hands with a tenderness no one had shown her in a very long time, and something in that woman's wall of defense began to crack. "He said you used to be a nurse," Agnes said quietly, no longer using that cold distance of the first night. "Yes," Ruby answered. "I used to be." And Agnes, who had lived long enough to understand that behind the words "used to be" there was always an entire tragedy, did not ask anything more. She only placed her other hand lightly over the girl's, a small touch that said everything. With Cormac, it was different. When the enormous bodyguard returned from the hospital after a few days, his wound stitched and carefully bandaged, the first thing he did was look for Ruby. He found her in the garden behind the house, and the large man who had walked through war stood silently before her for a long while, his calloused hands twisting his cap like an awkward boy. "You saved my life," he finally said, his voice rough. "The doctor said if it had been only 15 minutes later, I wouldn't have made it. I've been doing this work for nearly 20 years. I've taken bullets for other people, but no one has ever risked themselves for me, especially someone who didn't even know who I was." Ruby only shook her head gently. "You were bleeding, and I knew how to stop the bleeding. That was all. Anyone in my position would have done the same." Cormac looked at her, then gave a faint shake of his head, and on his weather-worn face appeared a rare smile. "No, miss. There were a dozen people in that room that night, and not one of them moved except you. The thing you think is simple is something most people spend their whole lives never managing to do." From that day on, the quiet bodyguard became a silent shadow always watching over Ruby, not to guard against a suspicious stranger, but to protect someone to whom he now owed his life. And so, day by day, the cold house began to warm little by little. The hallways that had once echoed only with lonely footsteps now occasionally carried soft laughter, the smell of toasted bread in the morning, the sound of Ruby humming an old melody as she watered the flowers in the garden. One evening, Weston found her sitting by the fireplace in the library, an open book resting in her lap, and he stood at the threshold watching her for a while before he came in. "Agnes laughed today," he said, sitting down in the armchair across from her. "I can't remember the last time I heard her laugh." Ruby looked up and smiled softly. She only needed someone to notice her. Sometimes people aren't lonely because there is no one around them, but because no one truly sees them. Those words made Weston fall silent, because he knew she was not speaking only about Agnes. He looked at the flames dancing in the fireplace, and for the first time in many years, the silence between him and another person carried no caution or calculation, but was simply two human beings sitting together beside a warm fire. "You're doing something strange to this house," he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the flames. "To everyone in it." Ruby closed the book. "What is that?" Weston turned to look at her, and in the flickering firelight, his usually cold gray eyes suddenly looked strangely gentle. "You're making it feel like a home," he answered, for the first time in 10 years. Although the house was growing warmer, and although even he could feel that change inside himself, Weston Kane was still a man who had survived 20 years in a world where trust was a luxury that could get a person killed, and that instinct did not release him easily. One morning, he called Cormac into the study, closed the door, and placed a brief request on the table. "I need to know who she is. Not to hurt her, but to protect her, and to protect us as well. I need to know where Ruby Callahan came from, and why a nurse ended up wandering the streets of Boston hungry and homeless." Cormac nodded, and with the connections and devotion of a man who owed Ruby his life, he began at once, quietly following every faint trace her life had left behind. It took nearly a week, and when Cormac returned to the study with a thin file in his hand, his face carried a heaviness Weston rarely saw in this composed bodyguard. "She lied about one thing, sir," Cormac began, setting the file on the desk. "But she didn't lie to deceive us. She lied because there are truths people simply cannot bring themselves to speak aloud." He opened the file. Ruby Callahan, 27 years old, once a nurse at a community hospital in the South End. According to every record, she was one of the finest nurses in the emergency department, loved by colleagues and patients alike. She had a family, elderly parents she lived with and cared for, and Mr. and Mrs. Callahan had run a small bakery in the neighborhood for nearly 30 years. Weston listened, and a feeling of unease began rising inside him, because Cormac's voice was growing lower with every word. "What happened next?" he asked. Cormac drew a deep breath. 3 years ago, Ruby's father borrowed money to save the struggling bakery. He couldn't get a loan from the bank, so he turned to a loan shark in the neighborhood, a man named Doyle Bracken. The interest fed upon itself, and the debt swelled until it could no longer be repaid. And when the Callahan family had no way left to pay, then Cormac stopped, and for the first time in all the years they had worked together, Weston saw the man's large hands tighten faintly. One night, the bakery and the apartment above it caught fire. Ruby's father and mother couldn't get out. The police file called it an electrical fault, an accident, but everyone in the neighborhood knew the truth. Doyle had someone set the fire to wipe out the debt and collect the insurance money he had already forced Mr. Callahan to sign over to him. Ruby was the only one who survived, because she was on shift at the hospital that night. She came home only to see everything she loved turn to ash. Weston sat in silence, and inside him rose a cold anger he knew very well, the kind of feeling that had once led him to the darkest decisions of his life. And what happened to her? How does a good nurse become homeless? Cormac turned to the next page. After the funeral, Ruby collapsed completely. She quit her job. She couldn't keep standing in an emergency room anymore. Then Doyle came back. He said the debt still wasn't finished, that Ruby now had to carry what was left. He threatened her, harassed her, made it impossible for her to rent any place in peace. She sold everything that remained to escape him, and from there she kept sliding down into the streets. For 3 years she has been wandering, doing whatever work she could find to survive, always moving so Doyle wouldn't find her. The night she walked into the Gilded Anchor, she had probably reached the very end of what she could endure. Weston closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the girl who had knelt down to save Cormac, the girl who had massaged Agnes's aching hands, the girl who had brought warmth back into his cold house, and now he knew what kind of hell she had walked through to arrive here. But when he opened his eyes, he noticed something strange. Cormac was still staring fixedly at the file, specifically at the name Doyle Bracken and the address of the neighborhood where the fire had happened, and the bodyguard's face had gone inexplicably pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the paper, and in his eyes there flickered something Weston could not read. A struggle, an obsession, almost fear. "Cormac," Weston asked slowly, his gaze sharpening. "What is it? Do you know this Doyle?" Cormac's head snapped up, and in one instant, his usual cold professionalism returned like a curtain dropping, hiding whatever had just appeared there. "No, sir," he answered, his voice calm, almost too calm. "It's only a name I've heard in the business. A piece of filth." But Weston had lived too long among lies not to recognize one the moment it was spoken, and he knew that his most loyal bodyguard was hiding something from him. Weston decided to set aside, for the moment, his unease over Cormac's strange reaction, because in those days his mind had been wholly consumed by another concern, a shadow that had been prowling around his empire for many months, and that he had only just begun to see in its true shape. It had started with numbers. Weston was careful to the point of obsession when it came to ledgers, and for weeks he had noticed that money was steadily leaking out of his businesses, amounts so small they would have been hard to detect if considered separately, but when added together across many months, had grown into a staggering sum. Someone was draining his empire from within, someone who knew exactly how every line operated, someone close enough to touch the financial arteries that only a very few people were allowed to know. And when Weston followed those threads, they all led back to the same man, the man he had trusted almost absolutely for years, the man who shared his blood, his own uncle, Ambrose Kane. Ambrose was Weston's father's younger brother, a man nearing 60 with silver-white hair combed smoothly into place and a courteous smile that never seemed to leave his lips, a man who always appeared in perfectly tailored suits and spoke softly like an upper-class gentleman. After Weston's parents died, Ambrose had been the one who stood beside him, advised him, and helped him keep the empire steady through its most precarious years, and because of that, Weston had given him a nearly untouchable position in the organization, a level of trust he had never granted anyone else. But now, sitting alone in the study late at night with ledgers spread across the entire desk, Weston realized that this very trust had become the blade his uncle was quietly holding against his back. He ordered a deeper investigation, more discreet than before, and what it uncovered made the blood in his body go cold. Ambrose was not merely embezzling money, he was secretly meeting with the heads of rival organizations, sworn enemies Weston had spent years and shed too much blood trying to hold back. He was quietly handing over information, operating maps, weak points in the defense system, in exchange for the promise of a higher position once Weston was overthrown. That courteous uncle with the perpetual mask of warmth was weaving a net to strangle the very nephew he had once sworn to protect, and his final goal was nothing less than the entire empire Weston had built. That night, Weston sat for a very long time in the dark, and inside him was a cold loneliness even more numbing than anger, because he understood that once his own blood could betray him, then nothing in this world could be certain anymore. But in the middle of that dark night, something pulled him back from the abyss of suspicion. It was the light spilling from beneath the kitchen door. He went downstairs and found Ruby sitting at the wooden table, warming a pot of milk, her red hair falling loose beneath the soft yellow light. "You can't sleep?" she asked quietly, showing no surprise, only silently pouring another cup of warm milk and pushing it toward him. Weston sat down across from her, and for reasons he did not understand, amid all the scheming people surrounding his life, amid blood relatives willing to stab him in the back, he felt strangely at peace, sitting beside this unfamiliar girl, a girl who asked nothing of him except that he finish the milk before it cooled. "There are people," he said softly, his hands wrapped around the warm cup, "whom we give our trust to, even a part of our lives, only to discover that they were waiting for the first moment we let our guard down to strike." Ruby looked at him for a long while, and she did not ask whom he was talking about. She only nodded faintly, as though she understood that feeling all too well. "I used to think the greatest pain was being hurt by strangers," she said gently. "But then I realized the deepest wounds always come from the people we believed would never have the heart to harm us." Weston lifted his eyes to her, and in that moment he suddenly understood that the two of them, no matter how far apart their worlds might be, were carrying the same wound inside. And in that quiet kitchen, while two dark lines of fate were silently tightening around them both, a ruthless loan shark from her past and a treacherous uncle from his own bloodline, neither of them knew that those threads of destiny would soon weave together, drawing them into the same storm. The fragile peace Ruby had found in the house by the sea was shattered on a night she would never forget. Ever since discovering Ambrose's betrayal, Weston had become more closed off. Secret meetings had taken place more often, and in his eyes Ruby saw a darkness growing thicker by the day, a darkness she did not dare ask about. That night she couldn't sleep, and when she went downstairs to find a glass of water, she heard voices drifting from the outbuilding behind the garden, a place she had never been allowed to enter. She should have turned away. She should have gone back to her room and pretended she had heard nothing. But something in those tense voices held her feet in place, and she quietly moved closer to the half-open window. What she saw made her whole body freeze. Inside that room, a man was tied to a chair, his face filled with terror, and standing before him was Weston. But not the man who had sat with her in the kitchen drinking warm milk, not the man who had reopened his sister's room because of her. This was another Weston, a Weston she had never seen, a man standing straight-backed with a cold composure, more terrifying than any rage, his voice low and even, yet carrying the weight of death. "You sold me out to Ambrose," Weston said, and though he did not raise his voice, every word made the air in the room turn thick. "You know what happens to traitors in this organization?" The bound man stammered and begged, his pleas breaking apart from fear, and Ruby saw Cormac and several others standing silently in the shadows behind him, waiting for an order. She did not see what happened next, because Weston only gave a slight jerk of his head, and his men moved forward, while she clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud, turned, and ran back into the house through the darkness, her heart pounding so wildly she thought it might burst from her chest. She rushed upstairs to her room, locked the door, and sank down onto the floor, her whole body shaking. Over all these days, she had almost forgotten who this man was. She had allowed his gentleness, his loneliness, the story of his sister to lull her, had begun to believe that beneath that cold shell there was a good man. But she had forgotten the price of the world he ruled, forgotten that the hands that had gently poured her a cup of milk were also the hands stained with the blood of countless people, forgotten that he was Weston Kane, the boss the entire city feared, and that fear had not come from nowhere. All that night Ruby sat curled in the darkness, torn between the two men she had seen inside him, and as soon as dawn began to break, she made her decision. She would leave. She pulled out her backpack and began packing the few belongings she had, telling herself that no matter how cold and cruel the world outside was, at least she understood that cruelty. While here, inside this beautiful house, beauty and death stood so close together that she could not breathe. But when her hand touched the old, worn medical notebook at the bottom of her backpack, the only keepsake left from her former life, she suddenly stopped. She thought of Agnes and her aching hands, now less swollen because of the warm water soaks. She thought of Cormac and the grateful eyes of a man who had once believed no one in this world would risk themselves for him. She thought of Marigold's room finally welcoming sunlight again, after 10 years buried in darkness. And she thought of Weston himself, of the moment he had told her she was making this house feel like a home for the first time in 10 years, of the naked pain in his eyes when he spoke of the sister who had died because no one had been willing to stop. People were never simply good or bad. She understood that better than anyone, and perhaps a person could do terrible things in the dark while still desperately longing to be redeemed beneath the light. Ruby sat down on the floor, hugging the backpack to her chest, and when the sun rose higher, she slowly took each item back out of the bag. She would stay, she told herself, but not as she had before. She would stay with her eyes wide open, with her heart fenced behind a layer of caution, because now she had seen both faces of this man, and she knew that the warm light she had brought into this house existed precariously at the edge of a dark abyss, where one wrong step could swallow her whole. The deeper the investigation into Ambrose went, the more Weston uncovered layers of secrets his uncle had skillfully buried over the years. And when Cormac brought him an old file retrieved from archives that had long been thought forgotten, Weston could never have imagined that what lay waiting inside it would be so devastating. "I found this while tracing his old transactions, sir," Cormac said, his voice unusually cautious. "I wasn't sure whether I should give it to you or not, but you deserve to know the truth." Weston opened the file, and his eyes moved over the lines, first with confusion, then slowly with a frozen horror that left his entire body motionless. They were records about Marigold's death, but not the story he had believed for 10 years. In the official file, his sister had died on the sidewalk from a stroke while trying to save a stranger, a random tragedy, an accidental cruelty of fate, and an indifferent crowd. But these documents told another story. At that time, 10 years earlier, Weston had still been a young man who had not fully taken power, and Ambrose had been quietly clearing the way to seize the position at the head of the organization. Marigold, though she stood outside the underworld, was Weston's only weakness, the only person he loved without condition, and Ambrose understood that as long as Marigold was still there, as long as Weston still had a reason to live, to endure, to become better, it would be difficult for him to manipulate his nephew. The documents revealed that the fateful night had not been entirely random. The strange man Marigold stopped to save on the street that night had been arranged to be there, a trap set for her kindness itself, because Ambrose knew too well that she would never walk past a fallen person without stopping. And when she knelt in the empty street to save him, the people who could have helped her, the people Ambrose had placed there to make sure no one arrived in time, had stood and watched her slowly fade away. Marigold's death was not the indifference of a nameless crowd. It was a murder perfectly disguised as an accident, carried out by her own uncle in order to break Weston's will and turn him into an empty, directionless man who would be easier to guide. And it had worked. After his sister's death, Weston had sunk into darkness, had locked his heart away along with that room, had become the cold and merciless man the whole city feared, and for 10 long years, Ambrose himself had stood beside him, playing the devoted uncle who comforted him, advised him, and slowly tightened the leash of control around his throat, all while knowing perfectly well that his own hands had killed the only girl Weston had ever loved. Weston let the file fall, his hands trembling, not from fear but from a terrible fury so great it reached beyond any anger he had ever known. For 10 years he had tortured himself with the question of what if? What if he had been there? What if he had protected his sister better? What if this world had held even a little more compassion? He had hated an entire city for its heartlessness, had built his empire on the foundation of that pain and loneliness, and yet through all those years, the true culprit had been sitting right beside him, drinking with him, smiling at him with that practiced, chilling politeness. Cormac stood silently, watching his master, and he knew this news had changed everything, that the coming war between Weston and Ambrose would no longer be merely a matter of power or money, but had become a mortal vendetta, a reckoning for a crime buried for an entire decade. "What are you going to do?" Cormac asked quietly. Weston stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the black night sea, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and sharp as a blade. "He took from me the only person in this world who still made me want to be a good man," he said. "Then he stood beside me for 10 years, watched me destroy myself, and smiled. He will pay for every single day of those 10 years. But even as those words left his mouth, another image rose in his mind. The image of Ruby sitting by the fireplace. The image of Marigold's room filled with sunlight, and a small voice inside him wondered whether the payment he craved was truly the path his sister, that gentle soul, who had only ever known how to save people, would have wanted him to take. Cormac's strange reaction when he saw Doyle Bracken's name in Ruby's file kept haunting Weston, and at last, one afternoon when the two men were standing alone in the rear garden, he asked directly, "You know Doyle, Cormac. I've lived with you long enough to know when you're lying. It's time you told me the truth." Cormac stood silent for a long while, his eyes fixed on the sea, and when he spoke, the seasoned bodyguard's voice sounded heavy, as though every word were being dragged up from some deep place he had tried for years to bury. "Before I followed you, sir, I had a stretch of life I'm not proud of," he began. "After I left the army, I came home with no trade except the ability to frighten people. I worked for men who paid, and one of them was Doyle Bracken. I collected debts for him. I threatened people who couldn't pay. It was filthy work, and I did it. I won't deny that." He stopped, his two hands tightening. Then one day, Doyle gave me a job. He said there was a family with a bakery who owed him a large debt they couldn't repay, and he wanted me to go there and, those were his exact words, warn them. But I knew Doyle. I knew what warning meant in his mouth. When I went to that neighborhood to look things over, I saw them. An old man and an old woman, kind-looking people, kneading dough in the shop, cheerfully arguing about how much sugar to add to a batch of bread. And Cormac's voice broke. They reminded me of my parents. I stood across the street watching them for a whole hour, and I couldn't do it. I went back to Doyle and told him I wouldn't take the job, that I was done. He laughed in my face, called me a coward, and said he would find someone else. 3 weeks later, I heard the bakery had burned to the ground. Neither of them got out. Weston stood motionless, and now he understood why his bodyguard's face had gone pale when he saw that name and address. "You think that if you had taken the job, you might have stopped it?" he said quietly. Cormac nodded, his eyes reddened. "I've told myself thousands of times that if I had been there, even just to give an empty warning and then tell them to run, maybe they would still be alive. I walked away to save my conscience. But because I walked away, Doyle found someone crueler, and 2 innocent people died. I left Doyle's world right after that. I swore I'd never do dirty work again, and then I met you. But that guilt, sir, it has followed me all these years. And now the girl who saved my life, the girl I would use my own body to protect, is the daughter of the 2 people I failed to save." The silence between the 2 men stretched heavy and long, with only the steady sound of waves striking the cliffs. But they had no idea that, not far away, Ruby had been standing there for some time. She had come out into the garden to find Cormac and ask him for help with something, and she had heard everything. The basket of vegetables in her hands dropped to the ground, and both men spun around, Cormac's face turning white as paper. "Miss Ruby," he choked out, "how much did you hear?" Ruby stood there, her whole body trembling, her eyes fixed on the large man she had come to regard over these past days as a friend, as a protector. "Enough," she whispered. "Enough to know that you once worked for the man who killed my parents." Cormac collapsed to his knees before her, the man who had walked through war, who had taken bullets for others, now kneeling on the grass with his shoulders shaking. "I didn't kill them, Miss Ruby. I swear on my life I had no hand in it. But I didn't save them either, and I've lived with that guilt every day. You have every right to hate me. You have every right to do anything you want with me. But please believe that the night you saved me in that restaurant, I felt as though God had given me a chance to make up for what I failed to do for your parents." Ruby looked at the man kneeling before her, and inside her was a storm tearing between pain, fury, and something else she could not yet name. She thought of herself, of all the times she had stood at the line between right and wrong, and she understood that sometimes people were punished not for the things they had done, but for the things they had not been brave enough to do. "Stand up," she finally said, her voice trembling but carrying no hatred. "I need time. I don't know what I feel right now, but I do know one thing. Kneeling like that doesn't save anyone. My father would have told you exactly the same thing." While the secret threads were slowly being untangled inside the house by the sea, somewhere else in the city, the two cruelest people in this story had found their way to each other. Ambrose Kane, with the sharp instincts of a seasoned predator, had quickly realized that his nephew was beginning to suspect him, that Weston's quiet investigations were closing in around him, and he understood that he needed a new card to play, a way to distract and break his nephew from within before Weston could make his move. And then he heard about the red-haired girl Weston had brought home, the girl who had changed the very air inside the fortress, the girl whom both Agnes and Cormac now protected with all their hearts. Ambrose understood at once that this girl was Weston's new weakness, and a weakness could always be turned into a blade. He had people investigate Ruby, and the trail led him to one name, Doyle Bracken, the man who had hunted the girl for 3 years. The meeting between the two men took place in a locked room behind a gambling house, beneath murky light and cigarette smoke. Doyle Bracken was a fat, heavy man with tiny, calculating eyes and the greasy smile of someone long accustomed to buying and selling the darkest things. "Ruby Callahan," Doyle sneered when he heard Ambrose mention that name. "That little thing owes me money, and she has been hiding from me for 3 years. Why are you looking for her?" Ambrose smiled, that courteous smile that never seemed to fade. "I'm not looking for her. I want to use her. And I believe you can help me, naturally for a generous payment, enough that you will no longer need to collect that old debt." Doyle's tiny eyes gleamed with greed. He dug into his pocket and threw a stack of old, genuine photographs onto the table, taken of Ruby during the years when she had been hiding on the streets, one showing her talking to Doyle himself in an alley, another showing her standing beside suspicious-looking men she had been forced to deal with in order to survive, another showing her accepting an envelope from a stranger. "Here," Doyle said. "These pictures are all real. That girl had to do all kinds of things to stay alive. Whatever story you want to build around them is up to you." And Ambrose, a master of lies, took those scraps of truth and wove them into a poisonous net. He knew that federal agencies had recently been pressing hard in their investigation of Weston's organization, knew that the deepest obsession of any boss was the fear of being betrayed by someone close and sold out to the authorities. So he created a perfect story. He hired people to forge documents, emails, and records showing that Ruby Callahan was not a homeless girl who had accidentally walked into the restaurant, but a planted agent, a federal collaborator trained to slip into Weston's trust, draw information from inside, and wait for the day the trap would be sprung to arrest him. Doyle's real photographs became evidence. The image of Ruby receiving an envelope was interpreted as her taking payment from an agent. The image of her speaking with strange men was turned into secret reports. Ambrose arranged every detail so carefully that even the most suspicious man would have trouble separating truth from falsehood. Then he let the file reach Weston through a seemingly reliable source, a middleman Weston had often used, so Weston would not suspect that Ambrose himself was behind it. "Do you really think he will believe it?" Doyle asked, counting the thick stack of money Ambrose had just pushed across the table. Ambrose stood, putting on his perfectly tailored suit jacket, and his smile was cold as ice. My nephew has spent 20 years learning only one lesson: that anyone who comes too close wants to destroy him. I do not need him to believe it. I only need to plant a seed of doubt inside him, and his own past will water that seed until it grows. People never betray what they believe most deeply about the world, and Weston believes he is not worthy of being loved. I am merely reminding him of that. And so the poisonous seed was planted, a seed nourished not by lies alone, but by the deepest fear hidden in Weston's soul, the fear that the warm light Ruby had brought into his life was nothing more than an illusion, a trap too beautiful to be true, and that he, a man who had never been loved without conditions, would finally be betrayed again in exactly the way he had always believed he deserved. The file reached Weston late one evening, and he sat alone in the study for hours, reading every page again and again, staring at each photograph while a familiar coldness slowly spread through his chest. This was the man 20 years in the underworld had forged. The man who knew that trust was a luxury that killed. The man who had seen even blood relatives stab him in the back. And now all the defensive instincts Ruby had slowly lulled to sleep over the past weeks woke all at once, screaming inside his head that he had been a fool, that he had allowed a pretty face and a few acts of kindness to deceive him, that he, above all people, should have known there was no such thing as something beautiful arriving in this world for free. He summoned Ruby to the study. When she stepped inside, she knew at once that something terrible had happened, because the man sitting behind that large wooden desk was not the Weston of quiet evenings by the fireplace, but the Weston from the room where the traitor had been tied to a chair, cold, distant, and dangerous. "Close the door," he said, his voice so even it was chilling. Ruby obeyed, her heart beginning to pound. "What happened?" Weston pushed the file across the desk toward her, the photographs spreading out like a hand of cards dealt by fate. "You tell me," he replied. "Explain to me what these are." Ruby looked down, and when she recognized what was in front of her, her face went pale. She saw herself in old photographs, moments from the darkest stretches of her 3 years on the streets, times when she had been forced to do things she did not want to do just to survive one more day, and she saw those moments twisted and distorted into a story she could not recognize. "This isn't the truth," she burst out, her voice trembling. "Weston, these photographs are real, but the story they're telling around them is completely fabricated. I've never worked for the federal government. I've never been planted here. I didn't even know who you were until that night at the restaurant." Weston stood, came around the desk, and she took a step back by instinct. "Do you know the problem with the best lies?" he said, his voice still low and steady, though every word cut like a knife. "They're always woven from threads of truth. You were wandering the streets. You did meet these men, and you did walk into the exact restaurant where I happened to be, on that exact night, and do the one perfect thing to get inside my trust, save one of my men. Do you have any idea what the odds are of something like that happening by chance?" Ruby shook her head, tears beginning to spill over. "It was chance. Sometimes life is nothing but cruel accidents. You know that better than anyone. Do you really believe I could fake starving for 4 days? Do you believe I could pretend to know exactly how to stop Cormac's bleeding? Pretend to know the symptoms of my own body?" She stepped toward him once, despite her fear. "Look into my eyes, Weston. You have looked into the eyes of every kind of liar in your life. You know when someone is telling the truth. Look at me and tell me you truly believe these things." But that was the problem, and both of them understood it. Weston had looked into her eyes, and a part of him, the part that had begun to trust, begun to hope, begun to let the light in, knew she was telling the truth. But the other part, the part forged through 20 years of betrayal and loss, the part that had buried his sister and locked away his heart, screamed that trust was the trap, that hope was the blade, that every time he allowed himself to love someone, the world found a way to tear them out of his hands. "Get out of here," he said quietly, turning his back on her, unable to bear looking at that face for one more second. "I need you out of my sight before I do something both of us will regret." And Ruby, standing there with her heart shattered, realized that what was killing her was not the accusation, but the look in that man's eyes when he turned away, the look of a man who would rather believe he was not worthy of being loved than dare to risk believing in something good. Ruby returned to the room at the end of the hallway, closed the door, and this time, when she pulled out her backpack, Her hands did not tremble with fear the way they had on the night she witnessed Weston's true self in the outbuilding. This time it was something else, something far more painful, an icy hurt spreading through her chest. Because last time, she had chosen to stay because she believed that somewhere behind that man's darkness, there was still a human being worthy of redemption. She had wagered her trust on him. And yet now, that very man had looked straight into her eyes and believed she was a liar, a spy, a snake he had foolishly brought into his home. She had shown him the truest part of herself, had cared for the people in this house with everything she had begun, however softly, to let her heart open to a fragile hope, and all of that had now been thrown back in her face like a fraud. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and old memories rushed in, impossible to stop. She remembered the evening she came home from her shift and saw the whole neighborhood where she had grown up swallowed in smoke and flames. Remembered the feeling of collapsing on the sidewalk when she understood that her parents, those two gentle people who had known only how to knead dough, bake bread, and love her without condition, were gone forever. She remembered the days after that, when Doyle came back with his greasy smile and told her the debt was still there, when the entire world she had once trusted crumbled into ash, when she learned the cruel lesson that her kindness could not protect anyone, not even herself. She had spent 3 years building walls around her heart so she would never again be foolish enough to trust anyone, and then she had torn those walls down for a man in a house by the sea, only to be hurt in exactly the same way all over again. A few hallways away, in the dark study, Weston was also sitting alone with an untouched bottle of liquor, and his own wounds were cutting into him just as mercilessly. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had done so many terrible things, and he thought of Marigold, of his sister's smile, of the day they told him she had died on a cold sidewalk while an entire city stepped past her. He had sworn at his sister's grave that he would never allow himself to be weak again, that he would never give his heart to anyone, only to endure that kind of loss once more. For 10 years he had kept that vow. He had lived like a sealed fortress, cold and untouchable. Then Ruby appeared, and somehow she had slipped inside those walls, had brought sunlight back into Marigold's room, had made him dare, for the first time in so many years, to think of something that resembled happiness. And that was exactly why those photographs were so frightening, exactly why he had seized on them like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. Because if Ruby was a traitor, then he could go on believing in the familiar, safe world he knew, the world where no one could be trusted and love was only a deadly weakness. But if Ruby was real, if she truly was the gentle and sincere person he had seen, then it meant he had been wrong for the past 10 years, and that he might have been able to live a different life, a life with light and warmth, if only he had dared to trust. And that truth was more terrifying than any lie. 2 broken people, inside the same house, separated by only a few walls, stayed awake through the darkness with wounds strangely alike, both torn between the longing to be loved and the terror of love's cost. At last, Ruby let the backpack fall to the floor, not because she had decided to stay, but because she realized that no matter where she went, she couldn't run from the truth that she had allowed that man to touch her heart. And in the darkness, she whispered to herself a question for which she had no answer. How could a person save you from the coldness of the world and still make you feel frozen all the way down to your soul? While Weston and Ruby each held their own wounds in the darkness, Cormac, the man who had carried a debt to the Callahan family in his heart for so many years, could not sleep. He knew Doyle Bracken better than anyone else in this house, and the fact that the man had suddenly appeared again, joining hands with Ambrose to harm Ruby, made him feel that something was wrong, that there was a missing piece he could not fit into place. Because Doyle was greedy, yes, but he was also calculating, and the fact that he had kept chasing a homeless girl without a penny to her name for 3 long years, spending effort and money just to track her down, did not make sense for a man whose nature was driven only by profit. A debt from a small bakery, no matter how much the interest had fed upon itself, was not worth that kind of obsession from someone like Doyle. There had to be another reason, something much deeper. Cormac followed the old connections in the underworld he had once walked through, knocked on the doors of people he had owed or helped in years past, and little by little, the horrifying truth began to appear. Ruby's father, Mr. Callahan, had not simply been a baker who fell into debt. Many years earlier, even before he borrowed money from Doyle, he had accidentally witnessed something he never should have seen. The Callahan family bakery stood on the corner of the street, and late one night, when Mr. Callahan went out to take out the trash, He saw with his own eyes Doyle and his men disposing of a rival, a case the police later investigated but never solved because there were no witnesses. Mr. Callahan, an honest man, had kept silent for years out of fear for his family's safety, but Doyle had always known there was a living witness somewhere out there, a ticking bomb that could destroy him at any moment. The loan had only been the perfect excuse. Doyle had deliberately lured Mr. Callahan into a trap of debt, so that when the time came, he could burn down the bakery, both erasing the debt and forever silencing the only witness who could send him to prison. But there was one thing Doyle had not expected. In the final years of his life, Mr. Callahan, because he was so afraid, had told the whole story of what he had seen to one person, the only person he trusted completely, his daughter, Ruby. And that was the real reason Doyle had never let her go, the reason he had hunted a girl with nothing left to lose for 3 long years. Ruby was not merely the last debtor of an old sum of money, she was the last living witness to a murder, the final loose piece Doyle needed to erase before he could sleep in peace. When Cormac brought this truth before Weston the next morning, the whole room seemed to freeze. Weston, though he had spent the night submerged in doubt over Ruby, now suddenly saw every piece fall into its proper place in an entirely different way. "Do you understand what this means, sir?" Cormac said, his voice urgent. "Doyle doesn't just want to torment Ruby. He wants her dead. He has wanted her dead for 3 years. And now that he has joined hands with Ambrose, now that he knows exactly where she is, she's in more danger than ever. The spy story Ambrose created wasn't only meant to divide you from her, it was also the perfect excuse. If you believed Ruby was a traitor and pushed her out of this house with your own hands, then she would be alone out there again, with no one to protect her, and Doyle could strike without anyone knowing. Ambrose and Doyle are using your own doubt as a weapon to kill her." Weston stood motionless, and a chill ran down his spine when he realized what he had almost done. Last night he had ordered Ruby out of his sight, had nearly pushed her back onto the road where Doyle was waiting at the end of it with a knife. He had almost become a tool in the hands of his own enemies, had almost handed the girl who brought light into this house over to death with his own hands. All because he had been too afraid to believe in something good. "Where is she?" Weston asked, his voice suddenly tense. And at that very moment, Agnes rushed into the study, breathless, her face white as paper. "Master Weston," she gasped. "Miss Ruby. Her bed is empty, and her backpack is gone. She's left." Ruby had left the house before dawn had fully broken, slipping quietly out through the side gate with her backpack on her shoulder, her heart heavy with a hurt she thought would never fade. She had no destination, only the knowledge that she needed to get away from the place that had allowed her to taste hope, then torn it out of her hands with such cruelty. She walked along the silent coastal road, and when she came near the old warehouse at the edge of the estate, a place she had once thought was only an abandoned storage building, she suddenly heard voices. She should have kept walking, but one name drifting out made her stop. Weston's name. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall, held her breath, and listened. Inside, 2 men were speaking in low voices, and what she heard made the blood in her body turn cold. "Mr. Ambrose wants it done tonight, at the harbor meeting," one voice said. "Weston thinks he's going there to discuss business with the Northern group. He doesn't know that group has already been bought. Once he walks into warehouse number 7, no one walks out. Ambrose has arranged for it to look like a gangland execution. By tomorrow morning, he'll be the man in charge, and no one will suspect a thing." The second voice gave a contemptuous laugh. For a man that suspicious, he still didn't see his own uncle coming. "That's almost funny." Ruby stood frozen beside the wall, her heart pounding, and in that moment a fierce battle broke out inside her. The man they were plotting to kill was the same man who had looked straight into her eyes the night before and called her a liar, a traitor. The man who had shattered her heart, the man who had driven her from his house. A part of her, the part still bleeding from the hurt, whispered that this was no longer her business, that she had been cast aside, that she owed that man nothing, that she could simply walk away and let fate decide for him, and it would only be fair. She could turn her back. She could keep walking down the coastal road and never look behind her again, and no one in this world would have the right to blame her. But then she thought of her father, of the 2 gentle people who had taught her that kindness was not something given only to those who deserved it, but something that defined who a person was, whether the other person deserved it or not. She thought of the oath she had taken when she first put on the white coat, the promise that she would save people, all people, even when they could not save themselves. And she understood that if she turned away now, if she allowed her pain to turn her into someone who could step over a dying person, then Doyle and Ambrose would not only have killed Weston, they would also have killed the person her parents had raised her to be. Ruby couldn't do that. She couldn't become the crowd that had walked past Marigold. So she ran. She dropped the bag to the ground, the only thing that held her whole life, and she ran back along the road she had just walked, ran with all the strength left in her thin body, her lungs burning, her legs shaking, but she did not stop. She rushed through the side gate, crossed the garden, and when she saw Weston's car about to roll out of the front drive, she screamed, a cry that tore through the morning mist, calling his name. Weston, sitting in the car with his heart in turmoil after hearing that she had left, suddenly jerked when he saw her, and he signaled for the driver to stop. Ruby ran to the car door, breathless, tears streaming down her sweat-speckled face. "Don't go to the harbor tonight," she gasped, gripping the car frame tightly. "It's a trap. Ambrose has bought off the Northern Group, warehouse number 7. They're going to kill you there and make it look like a gangland hit. I heard everything at the old warehouse. Please, don't go there." Weston looked at her, the girl he had driven away the night before, the girl who could have walked away and let him die, and yet here she was standing before him, trembling and exhausted, having left everything behind to come back and save the very man who had rejected her. And in that moment, every doubt inside him dissolved like mist beneath sunlight, because no spy, no traitor in this world would come back to save the life of her own target. Only a person with a clean heart could do what Ruby had just done. He stepped out of the car, and without saying a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding that small, trembling woman tightly, as though she were the last precious thing left in the world. They went back into the house, and Weston brought Ruby into the study, the very room where the night before he had pushed that poisonous phial toward her and called her a liar. He poured her a cup of warm water with his own hands, placed a blanket around her shoulders, and when she had stopped trembling as much, he sat down across from her, and for the first time in his life, the man who had never bowed his head before anyone did something he had once believed he could never do. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was hoarse, heavy with weight. "Last night I looked into your eyes and called you a traitor, when everything in me knew it was a lie. I let my fear speak instead of listening to the truth, and this morning, when I learned you had left, I realized I had nearly pushed you straight into the hands of the man who wants to kill you. No apology is enough for that." Ruby looked at him, and the wound from the night before was still raw inside her, but she also saw the naked sincerity in this man's eyes, a sincerity she knew must have cost him dearly to speak aloud. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "Why was it so easy for you to believe I was bad? After all these days, after everything I've done in this house, why were you still ready to believe the photographs of a stranger instead of believing your own eyes?" Weston fell silent for a long while, and when he spoke, he confessed something he had never admitted to anyone. "Because believing you were bad was easier," he answered. "If you were a traitor, then the world was still exactly what I had always believed it to be. A place where no one could be trusted, where love was weakness and kindness was a trap. But if you were real, if you truly were the person I had seen, then it meant I had been wrong for the past 10 years, that I could have lived differently, that I had locked my heart away for nothing. And that truth was more frightening than any lie, Ruby. Admitting that you are real also means admitting that I have built my entire life on the wrong foundation." Ruby felt the anger inside her begin to soften, because she understood what he had just said more than he could imagine. She understood the fear of trusting, the way pain teaches a person that staying closed off feels safer. "Me too," she admitted quietly. "I built my own walls too. After my parents died, after what Doyle did, I told myself I would never let anyone close again. And yet I let you come close. And when you called me a liar, it felt as though I was being punished for daring to trust again." She lifted her eyes to him. "This world taught both of us the same wrong lesson, Weston, that closing our hearts is the only way to survive." And then, in that study warmed by firelight, two broken people were completely honest with each other for the first time. Weston told her everything, about Ambrose's betrayal, about the money being drained away, about the plot to ally with his enemies, and finally, in a choked voice, about the horrifying truth he had just discovered, that Marigold's death all those years ago had not been an accident, but a murder arranged by his own uncle. Ruby listened, tears rolling down her cheeks, and when he had finished, she reached across the desk and took his hand. A touch, not of someone beneath him holding the hand of someone above her, but of two people standing together on the same ruined ground. Then Ruby told him the truth Cormac had uncovered, that her father had been the witness to a murder, that Doyle had killed her whole family to silence him, and that she herself was now the last living witness. When both of them had poured out the secrets weighing down their souls, something changed in the air between them, a deep understanding, a bond forged from the very wounds they shared. Ambrose and Doyle joined hands to destroy both of us, Weston said, his eyes now sharp again but no longer carrying the lonely coldness they once had. They thought fear and pain would make us turn our backs on each other, make us weak and alone. But they were wrong. Without meaning to, they drove the two people they wanted to destroy onto the same side. Ruby tightened her grip on his hand, and in her eyes there shone a new resolve. "Then we fight," she said, "but not their way. Not with darkness. My father died because he stayed silent too long out of fear. I won't make that mistake. It is time to drag everything they buried into the light." And in that moment, a true alliance was born. Not between a boss and a refugee, but between two people who had finally found in each other the thing they had both lost long ago, someone to trust. The next morning, a plan slowly began to take shape in Weston's study, where 4 people sat gathered around the large wooden desk. Weston, Ruby, Cormac, and Agnes, a strange alliance made up of a boss, a nurse, a guilt-ridden veteran, and a loyal housekeeper. Weston had been thinking all night, and what he realized was that the key to bringing Ambrose down did not lie in strength, because in the dark, every man had guns and knives, but in his uncle's fatal weakness, his arrogance. "Ambrose has spent 10 years believing he is smarter than I am," Weston said, his eyes cold and sharp yet calm. "He believes he has controlled me like a puppet all these years, that I have been too grief-stricken and blind to see the truth right in front of me. That belief is what will destroy him. A man who is certain he is winning becomes careless. His plan was intricate and dangerous. Instead of avoiding the trap at the harbor, Weston would pretend he knew nothing at all. He would play the part of the nephew who still trusted his uncle completely, an obedient prey walking straight toward death without the slightest suspicion. At the same time, he would let Ambrose believe that the spy story about Ruby had worked, that he had driven her away in a fit of rage and was now alone, wounded, and more vulnerable than ever. A lonely, directionless Weston was exactly the prey Ambrose was waiting for. "I'll meet Ambrose today," Weston continued. "I'll tell him I discovered Ruby was a spy, that I'm grateful he warned me, and that I threw her out. I'll let him see a broken, isolated nephew who once again has to lean on his beloved uncle. He will believe it, because it is exactly the story he wants to believe, the story he worked so hard to create." Ruby, sitting beside him, frowned with worry. "But that is too dangerous. If you walk into that meeting, no matter how prepared you are, they could still strike at any moment." Weston turned to look at her, and in his eyes there was a new softness. "That is why the meeting won't take place at their harbor. I will convince Ambrose that, to make sure I can be eliminated without leaving traces, we should meet at a neutral place, a place I choose, under the pretense of discussing how power in the organization will be divided after the federal threat is removed. Greed will make him agree, and on my turf, I will be the one pulling the strings." The roles were divided clearly. Cormac, with his experience and old connections, would be responsible for positioning Weston's men, the truly loyal ones he had carefully screened, in hidden places around the meeting site, ready to respond if anything slipped beyond control. He would also be the one to collect and protect every piece of evidence, because more than anyone, Cormac understood that this time they were not fighting to kill, but to expose the truth. Agnes, who had served the Kane family for 25 years and knew nearly every servant and attendant in their world, would act as their eyes and ears, quietly confirming through her own connections that Ambrose had indeed bought off the northern group, gathering testimony that could be used. And Ruby, though Weston at first firmly wanted to keep her outside the danger, finally won a role of her own. "I am the last witness to the crime Doyle committed," she said, her voice resolute. "My testimony about what my father saw can send Doyle to prison. And Doyle is the weakest link in their alliance. He is greedy and cowardly, not loyal. If we can make him turn against Ambrose, make him confess everything to save himself, then we will have everything we need." Weston looked at her for a long while, and though every protective instinct in him wanted to keep her far from danger, He also understood that this girl was not someone who would stand on the sidelines when there was a right thing to be done. "All right," he finally nodded, "but you will never be alone. Cormac will be with you every single second." When the meeting ended, and each of them scattered to prepare for their part, Weston remained by the window, looking out at the sea, and for the first time in 10 years, the anger inside him was no longer a blind fire burning everything in its path, but something cold, sharp, and purposeful. He would not kill Ambrose in the dark the way his old self surely would have done. He would do something far more difficult, something Marigold, his sister who had only known how to save people, would be proud of. He would drag his enemy into the light and let justice pass judgment. The plan had been laid out, but Weston understood that in order to bring Ambrose down completely, so that justice could truly pass judgment on him, they needed more than assumptions and scattered pieces. They needed a voice from inside, someone who had seen things with his own eyes, a confession that could turn Ambrose's entire castle of lies into ash. And Cormac, with the sharp instincts of a man who had spent half his life in darkness, found that missing link. Among Ambrose's inner circle was a man named Silas Renner, someone who had worked for him for many years, one of the few people who knew his darkest secrets. But Cormac also knew something Ambrose had never bothered to care about, that Silas was gravely ill, that he did not have much time left, and that in the final months of life, people often began thinking about the sins they carried, about the price their souls would have to pay. Cormac went to Silas, not with guns or threats, but with something men like Ambrose could never understand: a chance to atone. He found Silas in a shabby little apartment, a thin man with hollow, exhausted eyes, and he sat down across from him, not as an enemy, but as someone who had also carried the weight of guilt on his shoulders. "I know you're sick," Cormac said softly, "and I know you witnessed what Ambrose has done all these years. I'm not here to hurt you, Silas. I'm here to offer you a chance very few people in our world ever get, a chance to leave this life with a clear conscience." Silas looked at him for a long while, his aging eyes bright with tears, and then, as though a dam that had held back water for too long had finally broken, he began to speak. He told Cormac everything, and each confession seemed to lift a part of the burden that had pressed on his soul for years. He told him about the money Ambrose had stolen, about the secret meetings with rival organizations, about the careful plan to overthrow Weston. But the most important thing, the thing that made even the battle-hardened Cormac fall silent, was when Silas spoke about Marigold's death. "I was there that night," Silas whispered, tears rolling down his gaunt face. "Ambrose arranged everything. He knew that girl would stop to save someone. He knew her heart better than she knew it herself, and he ordered us to stand there and watch, not to help, not to call an ambulance, just to stand there until it was too late. I stood there, sir. I stood there and watched a good girl slowly fade away on the sidewalk, and I did nothing. I have carried that sin with me every night for 10 years. She only wanted to save people. That was all she ever wanted." Cormac quietly placed a small recorder on the table, the device that had captured every word of the confession, and Silas looked at it, then nodded. "Use it," he said. "Let it be useful for something. I have nothing left to lose, and maybe this is the only decent thing I can still do before I go. Tell Weston his sister didn't deserve to die like that, and that the man who killed her lived comfortably beside him for 10 years with a smile on his face." When Cormac brought the recording back to the house by the sea and played it for Weston, the whole room sank into a heavy silence. Weston sat motionless, his hands clenched tightly, listening to every word of the confession confirm what he had known but still could not bear to accept. And when the recording ended, he closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down the cold face that had not wept for 10 years. Ruby stepped to his side and placed her hand on his shoulder, and she said nothing at all, because there are kinds of pain that words only make smaller. "Now we have everything," Cormac said quietly. "The confession about the money, about the betrayal plot, and about Marigold's death, together with Miss Ruby's testimony about Doyle's crime. We have enough to bury both of those men beneath the weight of their own sins." Weston opened his eyes, and in them now there was not only pain, but also a strange calm, the calm of a man who had finally seen the road ahead. "Then it is time," he said softly. "It is time to end this, once and for all, not with blood, but with the truth." Outside, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, staining the sea red, and all 4 people in that room understood that tonight, when they stepped into the trap they themselves had set, Everything would change forever. The meeting took place that evening, inside a vast, derelict structure Weston had chosen, a neutral place with tall windows and sickly yellow light falling over the cold concrete floor. Ambrose arrived with the confidence of a man who believed he held every card in his hands, stepping inside in his perfectly tailored suit, the familiar, deceptive grin resting on his lips, and beside him, lurking in the shadows like a hidden beast, was Doyle Bracken, his tiny eyes darting warily around the room. "My dear nephew," Ambrose said, his voice sweet as honey, "I am very sorry about that girl. I warned you that no one who gets too close can ever be trusted. But now she is gone, and we can return to what matters, the future of this organization." Weston stood in the middle of the warehouse, both hands in his pockets, his face wearing exactly the broken, lonely look Ambrose expected to see. "Yes, Uncle," he answered, his voice low. "You were right. You were always right. I should have listened to you from the beginning. For the past 10 years, you have been the only person I could trust." Ambrose's smile brightened, and he stepped forward, placing a hand on his nephew's shoulder with false affection. "That is right, my boy. It is only you and me, blood family. That is the only thing in this world worth trusting." And in that very moment, when the hand of the man who had killed his sister rested on his shoulder with such lying tenderness, Weston lifted his head, and the brokenness on his face suddenly vanished, giving way to a cold calm more terrifying than any rage. "Blood family," he repeated softly. "You know, I used to believe that too. I believed it for 10 years. He took a small recorder from his coat pocket, held it up, and pressed the button. Silas Renner's voice rang through the empty warehouse, clear down to every word, telling the story of that fateful night, exposing Ambrose's order for them to stand by and watch as Marigold slowly faded away, telling everything. Ambrose's face slowly changed, his smile freezing and then crumbling, a bloodless pallor spreading across his features as each word of the confession struck his ears like a hammer blow. "Where did you get that?" he stammered, his false composure finally collapsing. "Silas is dead. He is still alive," Weston answered, his voice cold as ice. "And before he leaves this world, he decided to do one last decent thing. He told me the truth about the night you killed Marigold. My sister, Uncle, the little girl you held in your arms when she was a newborn. You killed her just to break me, just to make me easier to control. Then you stood beside me for 10 years, watched me destroy myself because of the pain you created with your own hands, and you smiled." Ambrose took a step back, and now that the mask of courtesy had fallen away, the true man beneath it could be seen, a man full of envy and greed that had eaten away his soul from within. "She should never have existed," Ambrose hissed, his venom finally spilling out. "As long as she was alive, as long as you had her, you had a reason to be soft, to dream of another life. I gave you a gift, Weston. I freed you from the thing that was holding you back." From the shadows, Doyle Bracken began backing toward the door, his tiny eyes frantically searching for an escape, because he was smart enough to realize that this ship was sinking, and he had no intention of sinking with it. But when he turned to run, he stopped cold. Standing in the doorway beneath the sickly yellow light was a figure he had hunted for 3 long years, the girl he thought he had finally pushed out of this life. Ruby Callahan stood there, not trembling, her eyes fixed straight on the man who had burned her whole family to the ground. "You have been looking for me, haven't you, Mr. Doyle?" she said, her voice strangely calm. "You hunted me for 3 years to silence the last witness. Well, I am here now. But this time, I'm not running anymore." And the moment her words ended, the warehouse doors flew open all at once, and Weston's men, the truly loyal ones, emerged from every side, surrounding the 2 guilty men. Ambrose and Doyle realized, far too late, that the trap they had believed they had set to destroy Weston was in fact the very trap now closing around their own throats. Ambrose and Doyle were restrained, forced down onto their knees on the cold concrete floor in the middle of the warehouse, and in that moment, Weston Kane stood before the crossroads toward which his entire life had been leading him. He looked down at the uncle who had killed his sister, the man who had taken from him the only person who had still made him want to become good, the man who had stood beside him for 10 years with a lying smile on his lips. And he looked toward Doyle, the man who had burned Ruby's whole family to the ground, who had pushed the girl who brought light into his life into 3 years of hell on the streets. This was the moment the old Weston had been waiting for. The moment every instinct forged through 20 years in darkness was screaming to be satisfied. All it would take was a nod, one quiet order, and both of these men would vanish from the world as so many other enemies had once vanished by his hand. That is justice, a part of him whispered. That is what they deserve. That is the blood debt that must be collected. His hand moved slightly, and Cormac, standing beside him, waited only for a signal. Ambrose lifted his eyes to his nephew, and in them, where arrogance had once been, there was now naked terror, but also something almost like expectation, because he understood the man he had helped create. "Do it," Ambrose hissed, his voice trembling yet still filled with poisonous defiance. "Kill me. That is who you really are, isn't it? That is the man I created. Do you think you are different from me? You are a killer too, Weston. There is more blood on your hands than there is on mine. Go ahead and kill me, and prove I have been right about you all these years." And it was those words, that final poisonous provocation, that made Weston stop, because he suddenly recognized a terrible truth, that if he killed Ambrose now, he would not be carrying out justice. He would only be proving that evil had been right. Ambrose wanted him to strike. Ambrose wanted his final moment to be the moment he dragged his nephew down to his level, turning Weston into exactly the monster he had spent so many years shaping. If Weston killed them, he would not win justice back for Marigold. He would only be betraying everything his sister had stood for. Marigold had not spent her whole life saving people and then died on a sidewalk so that her death could become an excuse for her brother to stain hands already red with even more blood. Weston turned his head toward Ruby, the girl standing at the doorway, and in her eyes he found no encouragement for revenge. No judgment either. Only a quiet question, a reminder of the man he was trying to become. She did not say a word, but her eyes said everything, that who you are, Weston, is decided in this very moment. And he thought of Ruby's father, who had died because he had stayed silent too long, and of what Ruby had said, that it was time to drag everything into the light instead of burying it in darkness. He understood that the easy path, the path of knives and shadows, would only close another circle of blood, and would forever imprison his soul inside the world Ambrose had trapped him in. The harder path, the path of truth and open justice, the path his sister surely would have chosen, was the only path that could truly set him free. Weston slowly lowered his hand. "No," he said, his voice ringing clearly through the silent warehouse. "I will not give you what you want, Ambrose. You want me to kill you, so that with your last breath, you can still tell yourself that you were right about me, that I am only a monster like you. But I won't do that. I will let you live. I will let you be dragged into the light, exposed before everyone, and punished by the very justice you believed you stood above. You will spend the rest of your life in a narrow cell, knowing that your own envy destroyed you, and knowing that the nephew you looked down on chose to become a better man than you ever believed possible." He turned to Cormac. "Call them. Turn them both over, along with every piece of evidence. We are going to do this the right way." And in that moment, as soon as the words had been spoken, Weston Kane felt something he had not felt in 10 long years. The sensation of a vast weight finally being lifted from his shoulders, the feeling of a man who had at last stepped out of the darkness where he had lived for far too long. That night, for the first time in the history of the Kane Empire, police cars entered the grounds of one of the most powerful organizations on the East Coast, not because they had been lured in or bought off, but because the very man at the head of that organization had called them there. It was a decision no one in the underworld could have imagined. A boss handing his enemies over to the law with his own hands, instead of settling them in the dark. And when the officers entered the warehouse, they found not only Ambrose Kane and Doyle Bracken restrained, but also a file so complete it was astonishing. Evidence carefully arranged over many weeks of investigation, recordings, financial documents, and most important of all, Silas Renner's confession and Ruby Callahan's testimony. Weston had prepared everything to make sure that this time, justice could not be bent. He understood better than anyone how money and power could make cases disappear, how men like Ambrose had always slipped through the cracks of the law, so he did what no one expected. He turned over not only the 2 guilty men, but also evidence that could implicate him, traces of the illegal things his own organization had done. "If I want real justice," he had told Ruby earlier, "then I can't demand it for others while standing outside the law myself. I will have to pay for what I have done. That is the right thing." Ruby had taken his hand when he said those words, and she understood that this man, the man who had once made an entire city afraid, was now choosing a path that required more courage than any act of violence he had ever committed. The case shook the whole city. Ambrose Kane, the man of perfect suits and courteous smiles, was dragged into the light as the man behind his niece's death, behind the betrayal plot, behind a string of crimes hidden for years. Silas's confession, though he passed away only a few weeks later, became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence, and the night Marigold Kane slowly faded away on the sidewalk was finally exposed for what it truly was. Not an accident, not the indifference of fate, but a cold-blooded murder. Doyle Bracken, faced with the weight of the evidence and the prospect of carrying all the guilt alone, behaved exactly according to his cowardly and greedy nature. He confessed everything in the hope of receiving a lighter sentence. Confessed to the murder Ruby's father had witnessed years ago. Confessed to the burning of the bakery. Confessed to the 3 years he had hunted Ruby in order to silence the last witness. Every word he spoke only tightened the noose of justice around his own neck and Ambrose's. Ruby sat in the courtroom that day, straight-backed and calm, and when she stood to give her testimony, her voice did not tremble. She spoke about her father, the gentle baker who had lived in fear for years simply because he had accidentally witnessed something evil. Spoke about her mother, about the little bakery warm with the smell of flour that had turned to ash, and spoke about the truth her father had trusted her with before he died. Every word she spoke was another brick in the wall of justice she had been waiting for through 3 long years. And when she sat down, she felt something inside her finally begin to heal. Not revenge, but acknowledgement, the truth finally spoken aloud. Ambrose Kane and Doyle Bracken both received the sentences they deserved. Long years behind bars. Enough for both men to live out what remained of their lives inside the very darkness they had sown for others. As for Weston, his road was far more difficult. His cooperation with the authorities, his voluntary surrender of evidence, and his commitment to dismantling all illegal operations within the organization were taken into consideration, and although he still had to face the consequences of his past, he chose to face them instead of running. On the night after the final trial, Weston stood on the shore behind the house, looking out over the black water, and Ruby came to stand beside him. "It is over," she said softly. Weston shook his head, but on his lips appeared a smile she had never seen before. "No," he answered. "This is only the beginning. An entire empire has to be taken apart. An entire life has to be rebuilt. But for the first time in 10 years, I'm no longer afraid of what is waiting ahead." 3 years had passed since that fateful night in the warehouse, and Weston Kane's world had changed so completely that no one could recognize it anymore. The underworld empire he had once built with such relentless effort had vanished entirely, dismantled piece by piece through those difficult years. Its illegal lines severed, its dark businesses shut down or transformed into transparent, legitimate enterprises. Weston had paid the price for his past, had faced the law honestly, and though that road had been long and grueling, he had walked through it with a steadiness he himself had never expected to possess. Now the name Kane no longer made people tremble when it was spoken in dark alleys, but had begun to be known for an entirely different meaning, tied to an organization called the Second Light Foundation, a charity to which Weston had devoted most of the fortune he had left. Ruby had chosen that name, and it carried a meaning only those who had lived through it could truly understand, that everyone deserved a second chance, a second light shining into the darkest corners of life, whether they were a starving homeless girl or a man who had been lost too long in the dark. The foundation was created to help the people society had forgotten, the homeless, victims of violence and debt, those who had fallen and could not find their way back, exactly the people both Weston and Ruby had once been in their own ways. But the most precious jewel in everything they had built stood in a place filled with meaning, the old warehouse at the edge of the coastal estate, the place once used to hide illegal goods, the place where Ruby had accidentally overheard the plot to assassinate Weston. That place, once thick with the smell of machine oil and darkness, had now been completely transformed. It had been renovated and painted a bright, clean white. Its large windows opened so sunlight could pour in, and the scent of antiseptic and fresh flowers had replaced the old, damp smell. It was now a free clinic, and on the sign hanging before the door was a name that made Weston's heart tighten with gentle emotion every time he looked at it. Marigold Clinic, a clinic named for the marigold flower, named for the sister who had spent her whole life wanting only to save people. Ruby had spent those 3 years healing, not only healing others, but healing herself. She had returned to school, completed the courses needed to reclaim the nursing license she had abandoned during the darkest days of her life, and now she wore the medical scrubs again, the symbol of the person she had always been, even on the hungriest nights she had spent on the streets. Every day she stood inside the clinic bearing Marigold's name, caring for people no other place was willing to receive, homeless patients with wounds long left untreated, poor people who could not afford a hospital. Human beings society had stepped past exactly the way an entire city had once stepped past Marigold, and in every patient she treated, she saw an echo of the oath she had taken years ago, and an extension of the legacy left behind by the sister she had never had the chance to meet. Agnes remained with them, no longer the cold, guarded housekeeper of that first night, but a mother, a grandmother, in the strange little family fate had pieced together. Her arthritic hands had improved greatly thanks to Ruby's patient care, and she was often present at the clinic, making tea for waiting patients, comforting frightened people with the very tenderness she had learned to let flow again. Cormac was there too, the man who had once carried the guilt of not saving Ruby's parents, now finding his own redemption in protecting and serving this new home, driving patients back and forth, repairing whatever was broken, and watching over Ruby with the eyes of an older brother. And Weston, the infamous boss from years ago, could now often be seen in simple clothes, carrying boxes of medical supplies with his own hands, speaking with homeless people as though they were human beings equal to him, because deep down, he understood that he was no different from them, also someone who had once been lost and had been granted a second light. It was a late autumn afternoon, when pale golden sunlight stretched across the spotless floor of Marigold Clinic, when the clinic door opened softly and a young woman stepped inside, her body trembling, her face pale from hunger and exhaustion, one hand clutching the other arm where a wound had been clumsily wrapped with a piece of dirty cloth. She stood at the threshold, her eyes filled with the caution and shame of someone used to being driven away, her feet looking as though they might turn and flee at any moment, and she spoke in a tiny voice, hoarse from weariness. "I'm sorry. I heard you treat people here without charge. I don't have anything to pay with. If that's not allowed, I'll leave right away. I don't want to bother anyone." Ruby, who was standing beside the examination table at the far end of the room, lifted her head, and in the moment she saw that woman, it was as though she were seeing herself from 3 years earlier, the same eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet still lit by a dignity that refused to surrender, the same posture ready to run, belonging to someone the world had taught to believe she did not deserve to be cared for. She set down everything in her hands and quickly walked toward the woman, and instead of a look of pity, she gave her a warm smile, as though she were welcoming an old friend. "You are not bothering anyone," Ruby said gently, softly taking the woman's uninjured hand and guiding her inside. "You came to the right place. Come in and sit down first. You look as though you haven't eaten or rested properly in a long time. First we'll take care of that wound, then I'll ask Mrs. Agnes to bring you something hot to eat. No one pays anything here, and no one is turned away. This place is for everyone." The woman looked at her, and her eyes filled with tears, because it had been too long. So long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have another person look at her with such kindness. Ruby helped her sit down in the soft chair, and just then, from the room beside them, Weston stepped out. The man who had once made the whole city afraid, now in a simple shirt with both sleeves rolled up, quietly knelt beside the woman, gently unwrapping the dirty cloth from around her wound with careful tenderness. Those very hands, the hands that had once caused so much fear in the dark, were now holding a clean bandage and meticulously tending to the wound of a stranger, and on his face was a peace no power or wealth could ever buy. Ruby stood watching that scene, and she suddenly realized how completely the circle had closed, because 3 years earlier, she had been that starving girl, walking into a strange place and daring only to ask for leftovers. And Weston had been the one who looked at her not as a beggar, but as a human being worthy of being offered a seat. Now they were giving someone else the very gift fate had once given them. And Ruby understood that such kindness would keep being passed on, from one person to another, like a flame lighting other flames without ever growing dim. Outside, in the sun-filled courtyard in front of the clinic, the children of patients were playing happily among the bright yellow beds of marigolds Ruby had planted in Marigold's memory, their clear laughter ringing through the warm autumn air, safe and joyful beneath the blue sky. An image of the future, of life continuing, of all the good things human kindness could sow and grow. And there, amid sunlight and children's laughter, Among people who had once been broken and had now found one another and themselves, the story of Ruby and Weston came to a close, not with an ending of power or revenge, but with the beginning of compassion and healing. This story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that the worth of a human being is never measured by what they hold in their hands or by their place in the eyes of society, but by the kindness they are willing to give and the dignity they preserve, even in the darkest circumstances. Sometimes, just one small act of kindness, just one gaze that looks directly at a forgotten person and offers them a seat, can change an entire destiny, perhaps even save a soul. Any one of us may have been lost, broken, or rejected by the world, but no one is undeserving of a second light, a chance to be healed and to begin again. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can listen to more meaningful and compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Ruby and Weston's story? And what part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the deepest feelings from your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment, and we wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and love in every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.